Welcome, everyone, to our program today. As you may know, Chevy Chase at Home brings neighbors together to offer the practical support and vital social connections to age confidently at home and stay active and stimulated. Chevy Chase at Home engages our community in social and educational programming, both in person and virtually, and provides volunteer services to older adults who need assistance, including rides, errands, tech support, household assistance, and friendly visits. One of the many ways we engage with the world is by bringing interesting speakers to share their insights and experiences with us. Our speaker today is Alex Seleznev. Alex recently left a large consulting accounting firm to focus specifically on the needs of those in or near retirement. He was cited by Bethesda Magazine as a top financial professional in 2024 and is an expert on estates, trusts, and insurance. Today, he will share the key considerations that go into deciding whether or not to move to a continuing care community. Welcome, Alex.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me for the second, not the third, but I think for the second time to present for Chevy Chase at Home. Of course, thank you everyone for joining us today. You know, the summer is almost here. We already experienced a couple of 90+ degree days, so it sounds like it's going to get even hotter. Uh,
Can you get Can you all mute yourselves, please?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No problem. Okay, so of course the topic for our seminar today is moving to a retirement community, or CCRC, and I will define what that term means a bit later. Is that the right move for you? And I'll tell you, this is perhaps one of the top topics of discussion for those of our clients, or let's say in later stages of their retirement. It tends to come up sometimes naturally, directly or indirectly. In some cases, it's really their family members that are making those inquiries. So we certainly have a lot to discuss today. This is one of the disclaimers I have to very quickly cover. We're a financial planning firm, again, in Rockville, Maryland. We're a SEC registered firm, and I just have to read this. Nothing in this webinar should be considered any kind of financial, tax, or investment advice, even though we're really not going to be touching much in those ideas. Now, if you do decide to, consider, perhaps even implement anything that I'm about to discuss today, I strongly recommend that you either do your own due diligence, or of course you work with qualified professional to help you with that. Again, just a quick disclaimer. Susan already introduced me, and by the way, I know that several of our clients are in this seminar, but I very much doubt that most people know me. So again, my name is Alex Seleznev. I'm the founder and president of Capital Squared Financial. And as Susan mentioned earlier, we're retirement planning specialists. We work predominantly with people who are thinking about transitioning, or perhaps in the context of our seminar today, who are already in retirement. Things like tax efficient income strategies is one of our focus areas. And again, back to the context of our seminar today, long-term care planning and legacy planning, and I'll tell you very frequently, they kind of dovetail into each other, is also one of the questions. We mostly work with families in our area, but we also have clients in other states. We always take a fiduciary approach when we work with our clients. I actually want to focus on this a bit more, just in case there are questions. Why is this guy talking about this? So we don't have any relationships with any CCRCs. I want to tell you that up front, so there's no hidden agenda of any kind. The seminar today is purely for educational purposes. So I do want to make that clear. There's none of that, hidden agenda. Okay, in terms of the overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll start with perhaps lighter topics. I'll put it that way. Why would you even consider transition into a retirement community or CCRC? How would you potentially prepare for a transition like that? Then we're going to go into more like meatier subjects like cost comparisons of staying at home or potentially transitioning. I will do my best to give you specific examples, usually simplified examples of how we handle certain situations, with our real clients. So you can see the context. And also one of the really important and also overreaching ideas, at least for me when we work with our clients, is how decisions like that impact them personally, how they impact their lifestyle, how they impact their family. In some cases, it's even more important than the financial side of things. So, I try to kind of weave in those ideas into the presentation today. Okay, so why would you consider transitioning to a retirement community? Well, I'll say something that perhaps most of you will agree with. Well, most of our clients and most people in general, they prefer to stay in their home for as long as possible. That's just that. Makes perfect sense. You've been here for the past, 30, 40, 50 years plus in some cases. You like your place, you like your garden, you love your neighbors. So, that's perfectly understandable. And that is pretty much always our starting point. Now, what you really want to prevent is essentially being forced to make a transition. And I'll start with a story here. One of our clients, she's been, single for quite some time. She got divorced, well, many years ago at this point. And, she used to live in DC in a pretty large apartment, actually. Everything was perfectly fine up until, she went to a grocery store. She fell, she broke her leg. Long story short, it healed, but it significantly impacted her mobility. So what we started noticing at first, of course, when I first learned about that, we made some connections. She had some aides who would come and help her out, 2, 3, 3, 4 hours a day. And then over time, she started asking for more help. So eventually it became, 6 to 8 hours. And that's actually when her daughters, the daughters are in New York actually, got involved. And what I started sensing and learning in some conversations, it was almost like a direct response. She was getting lonely. So it wasn't so much about the aides coming to her house to help her out on the medical side. She just wanted someone to talk with. So the idea of social isolation, which is frequently a result of limited mobility, is certainly something to keep in mind. Do you have a support network? I don't have to go far. Well, Chevy Chase at Home is great, where neighbors are helping neighbors. That's awesome, and I love the concept. One thing I'll say, and that almost always comes up, children are not always the best choice for that network. And I'm not trying to, again, to put any kind of negative context in that, but think about it. They're adults at this point, right? They have their lives. Perhaps they don't even live in this area. If you ever ask them, well, chances are they will say, of course, I want to help out, but is this something they can do for you in the long run? And at least in my experience, again, it doesn't always seem to be the best choice. So the idea here is for you to explore your options ahead of time, which is, of course, what you're doing now. Okay, so let's kind of dive into this a bit more. I would like to assume that most of you are familiar, but just to kind of cover our bases here, what is a CCRC? Well, what it stands for, it's a continuing care retirement community. And essentially what that is, and there's so many different options, so many different choices at this point, this is a campus-style community that provides a full continuum of care. Usually you would start with the independent living component, where you essentially live at a CCRC. They perhaps provide some meals to you, some housekeeping, but you're essentially managing on your own. So very frequently when people make that decision, let's say earlier in their retirement, that is essentially what it would look like. Then the next stage is assisted living, where again, you essentially live on your own, but now there is 24-hour access to staff. So there's always someone to support you. Skilled nursing, which is what people frequently need, again, when compare that to perhaps needing aids 6, 7 hours a day. And in many cases, especially in higher tier communities, you're looking at highest level of medical supervision outside of a hospital. And later stages, we're talking about memory care units, which is a structured environment for residents, usually again with later stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, other issues as well. It doesn't mean that every CCRC necessarily provides this. There are other options too, but just to give you kind of like a good idea of what that entails. In the previous, seminars on the subject, I used to have a couple of slides that kind of dive into the lifestyle choices. I thought today would focus on other things, but I'll just say this, what does it mean from your perspective? Well, for you, a potential transition comes with a built-in social life. You have meals taken care of, if that CCRC offers that, and there's always someone to help you out. From the perspective of your family, well, it gives them peace of mind for the same reasons. Again, there's always someone to help you. And the second point is important. Your adult children get to be a son or your daughter again, rather than a handyman or a caretaker. And this, again, where I'll share real conversation I had a couple of months ago. We would put it in our weekly newsletter. I met with the daughter of one of our clients, long-term clients, and I've been working with both of them for a while. We started talking about her father's finances. He decided to age in his house in DC. Everything is, working well. He's been declining somewhat. And as we kept talking about it, one of the things she said, even though we talked about this in the past, I never thought that my father would need so much of my time. And again, I remember that because they were very open about conversations like this. I was part of those conversations. They talked about the financial component. Everything was taken care of on the financial side. There were policies in place, portfolio was rearranged. But she never thought, how much time it would take to arrange for that care, to cover maintenance, to, of course, visit him. Meantime, she had to experience the decline on her father's side. I thought you only needed for
one chair.
So keep that in mind. Okay, in terms of the CCRC options, well, there are two broad choices: the rentals and their buy-in community. So we'll really start digging deeper into this. When you're making a decision like this, at least on the financial side, well, there are three important considerations for you to keep in mind. Of course, the financial component, how that will impact you in the short and long term. There's a tax consideration. And, specifically, if you go with the buy-in option, there's an estate planning component. So I'll, dissect all of this for you. So here are the three common options: monthly rentals. And by the way, someone asked me this question just recently, at least, based on my observations for our areas, most of the newer communities, they're really under the monthly rental model. Well, the way it works, there is a fee that you would be paying on a monthly basis. There's a good possibility that it will increase over time, perhaps even significantly. And some of them, they even publish their anticipated, fee increases. From the perspective of your plan, they're actually relatively easy to evaluate, because if you decide to transition, what you're essentially doing, you're comparing your existing costs, let's say in your house, to the cost that you would have once you transition to a community like that. The second option, think of it as in between. That's the buy-in option, where there's a buy-in component, but if you vacate the property, let's say within 50 months, your estate will receive a certain amount back, and it's proportionately declines over time. Why would you ever decide to take that option? Well, again, it usually comes with a lower monthly fee. And then the third one, which is really the most complex one to analyze, but it can also be quite valuable, is when you have a large buy-in, and you'll see, I'll make some examples. It can be as much as, the highest one I've seen so far was 1.7 million. Perhaps they can be even higher, but the highest one I've personally worked with was 1.7 million. So, once you vacate the property, 20, 30 years down the road, well, your estate will receive, 50 to 90%. So it's refundable to your estate. Why is this, complex decision to evaluate? Well, how are you going to finance it? Are you going to sell your house and, move in, which is, by the way, the most common option? You have to consider, of course, your capital gain taxes. You have to understand your basis, and I actually touched on that in a separate seminar. If you have a brokerage account and you're going to be selling your investments, well, similar issues, exactly how, what kind of tax consequences you're going to have. If you have significant retirement or IRA accounts and you just decide to take out, I'll just say $1 million out of it, well, there's a good probability that, you're going to get hit quite hard by taxes. So again, all of this really needs to be considered way in advance. And again, I'll make some examples as we go. So the buy-in component, this is where I just wanted to focus a bit more because again, it's quite significant. Every so often I get this comment, from our clients or someone else, it's an investment. Well, I would definitely put a question mark there, not to get overly technical here, but there's no market appreciation. So again, back to my, $1 million example, you receive 90% of it back, let's say 900,000, but there's no growth of any kind. So essentially declines in value due to inflation, and it's payable to your estate. If you're not planning for it carefully, there's a potential significant tax expense because you have to make that payment. And the third point here, and it's an important one, well, what if, what's the possibility that the CCRC or the retirement community that you transition to actually runs into financial trouble or fails? And I'll tell you up front, it's a very common question. This is very uncommon. I actually haven't heard of any issues for any of them in our area, but it's possible. I've heard of, other CCRCs around the nation failing. The way I like to think about it, well, let's say, a transition, the buy-in is, 50% of your assets, right? Let's say $500,000 buy-in and your total, financial assets are right around $1 million. That's a significant financial risk. That's 50% of what you have. So you should really be thinking about that. On the other hand, if you have a larger portfolio and the buy-in is a, relatively small portion of that, well, perhaps that risk becomes much more manageable from that perspective. The bottom line is, before you make any of these decisions, you should absolutely review their financials. This is a very technical point. I just cannot cover it today, but you should review the financials of the retirement community that you're considering. Okay, rental communities. Why would you want to do it? Well, much lower upfront costs, much higher flexibility. You'll see in a moment when I show you some examples. Usually the so-called community fee is anywhere between perhaps 20, 50,000. Not that it's a small amount, but that's that. And then the monthly fee is higher. One of the, of course, disadvantages here, you should absolutely expect your costs to increase in the future. Just like, if you're renting, as I'm sure many of you experienced, rents do increase over time. If you decide to transition to a community like this, perhaps you want to move closer to your children, as an example. You're ready to sell your house, it's too big, too much maintenance, you want to move somewhere and stay at a community like that. Well, that's fine, but also keep in mind there will likely be higher turnover because it's easier to get in. And at the same time, if something changes and you simply don't like it, well, it's much easier to get out compared to, of course, a buy-in community. So how would you choose? And, this is where I just wanted to show you a couple of bullet points that will hopefully be helpful. For the rental model, well, again, and they're becoming more and more, I would say, attractive in general, you would want to go in that direction if keeping your funds liquid is your priority. Perhaps you're thinking about moving again in the future, you're just not sure. Or, let's say you reviewed different options and you're just not ready to commit to any single CCRC operator. With the buy-in model, well, in some sense, as the name hopefully implies, well, presumably you would want to stay there in the long run. This is a very significant financial commitment that you will be making. So that's the assumption here. you're comfortable with the financial strength of the community. Again, I mentioned earlier, but it's really a must regardless of the option you choose. And of course, if you value cost predictability, I'll dive into this a bit later, but essentially by making a buy-in payment, as a result of that, your future costs will be lower. So how to prepare for a transition like this? Well, when is a good time to begin your research? And just like with, I would say, financial or retirement planning in general, where the sooner the better, and perhaps again why many of you are joining us for this seminar today. But I would say 2 to 3 years is a good time. One of the things to keep in mind, some of the top tier communities, at least in our area, actually do have relatively long waiting lists. So even if your financials are in order and you're ready to transition for any reason, it doesn't mean that they'll have room available for you to transition. So you have to keep that in mind. Well, let's say again, you've been in your house for the past 20, 30, 40 plus years, and you feel like maintenance starts to feel like a burden rather than a joy. I don't know if there are too many people who think of house maintenance as a joy, but at the same time, if it's really something that bothers you, perhaps that's one of the trigger points. As I was mentioned earlier, when you start noticing shrinking social circle or a feeling of isolation, right? You're on your own most of the time in your big house. And perhaps when you start seeing minor difficulties with managing your medicines, there's a history of trips and falls. And I'll tell you, in practice, again, for some of the more successful transitions that I've been involved in some sense, when you anticipate all of those things and you make your decisions before this actually happens. In terms of your finances, well, goes without saying, you need to understand your finances. I would like to assume that pretty much everyone who joined us today at this stage in your life, you have a financial or retirement plan in place. Again, doesn't have to be complex, but I assume you have something. And as I mentioned earlier, you really need to understand the tax consequences of making these decisions. This is, again, perhaps one of the most important financial decisions you'll make. So you want to make sure you understand the tax consequences. One of the things, the second bullet point that you can do now, regardless of your timeline, well, if you sit down and you compare your current cost of living, and it doesn't hurt to understand your current expenses with the monthly fees at different communities, they can share that information with you in most cases, that could be a potential starting point. And what I mean by that, we had a number of clients who decided to do exactly that. They just wanted to sit down and compare. They're not willing to commit to anything. They realized, in some cases, that where they are at this point is so affordable and the cost is so much lower, even when you take into consideration, like home aids as an example, that transition in the near future simply doesn't make any sense. There are other situations when people sit down, they compare the two, they have certain ideas, but then they realize, well, wow, if I transition, I don't have to do any of this, no home maintenance, none of those things, and the overall costs are more or less the same. So something for you to keep in mind. Of course, where we step in, and I'm not going to go over this in much detail, the idea of reviewing and projecting how any of these decisions would impact you in the long run. That's very important because, well, once you transition, especially once we talk about, buy-in communities, well, there's a strong possibility that, you're going to be there for a long, long time, hopefully. So you want to make sure that, on the financial side, there are no issues. Well, what are some of the top mistakes to avoid? Well, as I've been alluding to throughout this seminar so far, well, the biggest mistake is when you wait for a crisis. You, in some sense, refuse to notice certain things. You wait, and then something happens, and you're in a rush to make certain decisions. Again, the very first story that I shared about our client in DC is an example of that. Well, I'll tell you, she is doing fine now. We talk, and everything seems to be fine, but it's not how she envisioned that. So she was not necessarily fully prepared for a transition like that. Once you start looking at different communities, and that's actually what I learned from our clients, because I a lot of this actually learned from our clients. If you decide to only visit once, and let's just say you decided to visit on a Saturday evening, and you see some kind of, party, people are enjoying themselves, and of course the staff at most of those places usually very friendly and welcoming, and it gives you a certain impression, and that's fine, but you need to visit more than that. Visit on the Tuesday morning, Thursday afternoon, talk to the current residents. Don't just talk to the staff, because in practice, you'll be interacting with the staff, but it's going to be about the residents. So again, this can prevent some unpleasant circumstances. Not involving your family in this decision early enough. And this is, again, what I notice quite a bit. I would say most of our clients, at least this is my impression, they're comfortable with having this conversation, but they don't go deep enough. They just don't go deep enough. They say, well, look, dear son, dear daughter, would you help me out if/when I need this type of care? Would you help me with that? Absolutely, mom. Absolutely, dad. But how would that happen in practice? Would they be willing to commit to do that for you multiple times a week, sometimes, multiple hours a day? What if they, again, live outside of this area? On the financial side of things, again, not stress testing your cash flow long term. Again, since many of you, or hopefully most of you, you're attending this seminar, you're learning in terms of your finances, you need to make sure that you're properly prepared for a transition like this. And of course, ignoring the tax hit of funding a buy-in. I was involved in multiple situations like that. Again, usually when it comes to the house sale, people sell their house, they walk away with a, 7-figure number. They forget about taxes. Here comes the tax season next year. It brings a lot of unpleasant surprises. That is perhaps the most common issue. All right, so now we're moving toward more, I'm going to say, meaty parts of the seminar. We're going to talk about the actual numbers and cost comparisons. So staying at home versus moving to a retirement community or CCRC. And we'll talk about some average, we'll talk about some actual numbers. So home modifications, I would say perhaps most of you already thought about that. If you're planning on staying in your house in the long term, there's a good possibility that you would need to make some modifications to make it agent friendly. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of reputable groups in our area who can help you with that. They would come to your house, give you estimates, explain how things work. So there's that. I'll give you this example. I've made this example multiple times in the past. We have clients who live in Gaithersburg. So they've been there forever, as far as I know. They explored their options. It's a single family, one level home. It's, not huge, but it's big enough for them. And again, they did the math. The total cost was right around $75,000, which, all things considered, actually not all that much, and they're very happy. So they're not planning on transition anywhere. They have everything they need in their house. We also have clients who live in Potomac. They have a 3-story house. It's a big house. Again, they've been there for a long time, and they're considering making it agent friendly. And again, someone came to their house to give them some estimates. Turned out the cost would be up to $300,000. In their case, by the way, the reason it was so much, they needed an elevator so they can actually go from the first level to the second, from the second to the third. And I'll tell you, they're still thinking about that, at least purely from the financial perspective. In their case, it doesn't make much sense. I'll make it more of a side note here. I guess it's related to this, but keep in mind that many modifications that would make your house more, agent friendly, there's a strong possibility that they will not increase the value of your home. Again, let's just keep that in mind. Like back to that elevator story, remember talking about this. Well, let's say if the house is, they do all those improvements, and they decide to sell the house 3-5 years down the road. Well, who would buy a bigger home like this? Chances are it would be younger family, potentially with kids. And from that perspective, having an elevator is actually more of a liability than anything else. So again, I don't want to necessarily take it too far, but things of this nature, least based on my experience, they don't necessarily increase the value of your house. Now, in terms of in-home aids, these are the averages. I took them from care.com, $22 per hour. This is at the end of as of the beginning of this year, as of 2025. In practice, there is a range, of course, depending on who is providing that care, what type of services, the quality of those services, but $22 per hour is the average. For skilled care, you're looking at $30 per hour. Again, it can be much higher than that depending on your needs and depending on who is providing that care to you. According to the Genworth study, and you can use it for planning purposes, at least initially, the average cost of that per person in the Washington, D.C. area is essentially $87,000 a year. So as a starting point, I'm comfortable with it, but you'll see in a moment, doesn't necessarily give you the full picture. The invisible costs, I touched about that separately. I don't necessarily want to go over that in much detail again, but keep in mind again, someone needs to be arranging this for you. Talking about long-term care specifically, when do you need it? When you're no longer able to perform any 2 out of 6 activities of daily living. So again, perhaps many of you know what that is. And usually for people in that condition, it's challenging to manage this. So there needs to be someone, presumably your children, your family members, who are doing this. And that, of course, creates those invisible costs. So keep that in mind. So this is a case study for one of our clients. This is a real client. I decided not to make any updates or adjustments here. So you can envision like a spreadsheet that includes all of her expenses. This is a snapshot of that. It's a 2-page spreadsheet. So a while back now, those pre-COVID, she decided to stay in her house long term, and that was her family's decision. Everyone agreed to that. On the financial side of things, she is doing fine. In 2024, as her situation progressed, she needed quite a bit of care. So we're talking, if I remember correctly, 10 to 15 hours a day. So the cost in that particular year in-home aids was over $209,000. So it compares, how does that compare to the averages? Last year in 2025, again, they just decided that given her the progression in her situation, she now needs it 24/7. So now we're talking about $245,000 a year. So again, this is quite an increase. Going forward, by the way, it's 24/7. It cannot increase anymore, but inflation becomes an issue. As many of you know, medical expenses and medical services tend to increase at a much higher rate than the general level of inflation. The point I'm trying to make, and this is what I sometimes hear, especially when we work with new clients or just people kind of inquiring on this, they see this averages of, let's say, $87,000 a year or some other average, and they assume it's just going to continue like that for the next 10, 15, 20 years. But that's not how it works in practice. And I don't know if I want to dive more into this. I hope you're hearing the point I'm trying to make. But over time, staying in your house will likely become more and more expensive. That's just the reality of it. And again, that's where the CCRCs can be helpful. Okay, so what does a CCRC actually cost? And this is where I wish I actually made this a bit larger font and perhaps bolded this. Well, costs vary significantly based on the community type, and again, significantly, location, and of course, their care model. They all offer something different. It's actually a very competitive market. So the ones you see on your screen now, by any means, I'm not saying these are good or bad. These are just the ones I personally worked on. That's why I'm including this information on the slide. So on the rental model, well, we have the Pinnacle. Perhaps many of you heard about it. They've been advertising quite a bit. So I believe they're opening soon in the summer of this year. So this is a rental community that comes with a $20,000 community fee, which, relatively speaking, is not that bad. the monthly fee at the Pinnacle, at least based on the numbers we had from our clients, is anywhere between 8,400 per month to 11,700. That depends on the unit you want. 1-bedroom studio, 2-bedroom. So they give you multiple options. Perhaps you heard about the Carnegie. The community fee in that place is anywhere between 30 to 90,000. They actually include 2 meals a day, which the Pinnacle does not include. But I thought it's a nice perk because everyone, of course, needs to eat. And their monthly cost is anywhere between 8 to essentially 16,000. In terms of the buy-in models, Ingleside at King Farm is one of the perhaps most popular. It's one of the higher tier, communities in our area. Well, before I talk about the monthly fees, their entrance fee, and my apologies, I should have made this larger. Their entrance fee is anywhere between 234,000 to 1.3 million, depending again on the type of unit that you prefer, usually the size of that unit. They offered 50 or 90% refundable options, which is what I talked about earlier. Now, in return for a higher buy-in, of course, well, the monthly expenses or the monthly fees are much lower. Again, if you just compare it to the Pinnacle as an example, so between 3,000 to 6,000. I'm just going to use rounded numbers. Similar for Woodmont Terrace, the village of Rockville, also one of the newer communities. Again, I'm not going to read this to you. We'll share the slides. You can look at it. But these are the actual comparisons. So that's when for this particular client, when we're preparing projections, we actually prepared it for all 5. So we analyzed all 5 scenarios and essentially showed her, well, you go with the Pinnacle. This is what it looks like for you in the long run. You go with the Ingleside, that, by the way, has that 1 to 2 year waiting period. This is what it's going to look like in the long run. Okay, now this is, I included this actually yesterday when I was finalizing working on the slides. So this is one of those top questions that is very frequently missed, and then once you find out, perhaps it creates certain unpleasant conversation. So does the monthly fee cover medical care? Well, in most cases it does not, and that's important. They will offer those services to you as part of the agreement, depending on the type of the property, or it's more of a fee for service type of model, but don't assume that it's included. What the monthly fee covers, which can be a very comprehensive list, utilities, some places cover meals, set number per day or per month, housekeeping, laundry. Yes, I'm not going to read the whole list to you, but it can be very comprehensive. What it typically does not cover is, of course, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing care, other different things. Of course, it wouldn't cover your, physical services. That's a different type of service. So to give you an example, Ingleside at King Farm, which is what I was referring to earlier, their independent living starts at a little over 3,000. If you later need assisted living, that jumps to anywhere between 10 to 17,000 on top of a buy-in that you already paid. So this is where your long-term care insurance, if you have it, and careful planning is important, right? So this is an important consideration for you. Keep in mind, by the way, I decided not to include it here. A lot of this medical expenses, if/when you actually start to incur them, will likely be deductible. So that gives you a pretty significant tax break. But just want to make sure that you understand this ahead of time and you include it in your analysis. Okay, so here's a case study. It's a real client. This is a simplified version here, and I believe actually this particular client is joining us today. But again, this is a very simplified version. So just to give you a little bit of context, single woman used to live in Bethesda, actually doing really well. And we looked into different options for her, and she's done a lot of research for many years. So by any means, that's actually one of the first things I perhaps should have said. Usually decisions like that they take, years, and that's perfectly fine. So she ended up at Baywoods, but we looked at other options too. So when she was in her house in Bethesda, she was actually in a pretty comfortable position, but maintenance, other expenses, and at some point you start thinking more and more about the future, medical expenses. So she had, over $1 million in financial assets portfolio. So her total income was projected to be right around 147,000. Her taxes around 31,000. If you don't mind, I'm going to skip, how we calculated that. That's not important for our seminar today. So her net of tax annual income was at right around 116,000. Her lifestyle expenses for her Bethesda home, maintenance and everything else, was right around 90,000. So you do this simple math, that leaves over 26,000 for everything else. We call it discretionary expenses, medical expenses in the future. So again, this is one of those issues when you work with people, in their house, it's like more than half in some cases of their assets. Again, on the surface, it doesn't necessarily give them that much to spend. Long story short, after having multiple conversations and projections and everything else, she sold her house and decided to transition to Baywoods. It's a great community. And by the way, when I looked at it, and I'm not advertising for them in any way, but they had a very comprehensive list of what they cover. Like, I was actually quite surprised by that. The value of her portfolio is now over 2 million, right? Because that's the house sale proceeds minus the Baywoods buy-in. So her annual projected income is much higher now. Her taxes are higher now. And again, I'll skip the part of how we calculated that. So the net annual income is much higher at this point, mathematically. There's the Baywoods fee. This is the annual fee of over 57,000. That doesn't include medical or very light medical expenses. The lifestyle expenses are now much lower. Why that's the case? Well, the Baywoods fee in this case covers most of the house-related expenses. So it was a, very clean transition from that perspective. So going forward, she now has access, if she ever needs it at some point in the future, or just becomes her inheritance, to over 96,000 a year, 97,000 for everything else, including, of course, potentially medical expenses in the future. Now, this is a success story, right? It's almost like a triple win. She's in a better place, I would say. The last time we talked, she already joined different groups, playing bridge, something I'm actually thinking about doing myself. I know it's really good for your brain. She's in a better financial position now. And in terms of, again, potential medical expenses in the future, there's now this cushion. Again, I don't necessarily want to make an impression that it's always this clean and beneficial, but this is one of those, again, success stories. And with that, I will open up for questions. If you have any.
Alex, someone asks, 1 second, gotta find this. Does community fee equal entrance fee? Is the community fee annual? For where
It's a
they
one.
have,
Sorry, Susan, I
no,
interrupted you.
just for where there's a community fee, right?
It's a one-time fee. I'll give you a short answer. It's a one-time fee. It's non-refundable. At least when I reviewed the documents, I didn't see any clauses for a refund. It's a one-time fee. Keep in mind, again, the monthly fees will likely, or let's just say they will increase in the future. And like I said earlier, they usually even give you some kind of estimate. Okay, this is our expectation for the next, couple of years.
Okay, I'm going to keep going with the questions. Do you pay property taxes on a buy-in property?
No. So that's the
Okay.
think of it as putting your funds in trust of sorts, and you would actually sign a legal agreement, which can be quite complex. I didn't go in that level of detail today, but for particularly large transactions, I actually had our clients meet with an estate planning attorney who specializes in elder care needs, because it's again, it's a complex transaction, but you don't pay any property taxes on that.
Does the cost profile differ between a single person and a couple?
Uh, I'm going to say my short answer is yes. I have the notes here. Perhaps I should have included here.
Sure.
So when you move in as a couple, I'm talking off the top of my head here, for the second person, the monthly fee is like 50%.
Right.
So, and that's actually how we did it for this particular client. Again, not to get in the weeds here, but her husband is not doing, particularly well. So we reviewed it both ways. What would happen if they're together, hopefully for the next, 10 plus years, and they're sharing the fee. And, when she's on her own at some point in the future, she would actually be responsible for a high, like a 70 or 80% of the fee. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay. Another question. Can you talk a bit about schemes like Goodwin House at Home, in which services are offered at home? Do you know much about that?
Very good question. I know very little about it. I attended one of their seminars, if I'm not mistaken, outside of something that I ever looked into like directly. So I would rather skip that question. I'm I'm
Okay.
familiar, but I just don't know details.
Yeah. When you get to the top of the waiting list, do you have to accept the offered place? Or if you're not ready to move, can you stay on the waiting list longer?
Well, so
Yes.
yes, yes, but then the problem is you don't know how long you're going to be waiting. So in this particular case, I believe they give them 60 days to make a decision. So they give you a little bit of time, but that's what I was saying earlier, 2 to 3 years. When you review your finances, you're ready to move forward, you need to be prepared for that. So again, in some of the top tier communities, yes, there is a waiting list, and when the opportunity comes your way, to make your decision.
How many years of a continuing care community's financial should you get to look at?
So the ones I looked at, they all included 3 years because that's what they're required
Okay.
to for audit purposes. By the way, I mean 3 is good. You see, that's now. I don't know if I want to say this or not, but essentially the way they work a little bit like Social Security. So existing and future residents are actually paying for the maintenance of the property. Yes, they have some funds and reserves, but that's that. They're essentially funded by current and future residents. So that's what you're evaluating for. It's not like there's a trust fund that holds millions of dollars. I mean, they have some money, but it's really about their ability to manage their operations going forward. So, but 3 years is my short answer. It's what's included usually.
Is it true that if two people sell their house, for example, that $250,000 of profits can go toward purchase of the CCRC property?
Uh,
Do you get that one?
Is it true? I see it in the chat box. If they're to sell their house, for example, okay. So well, I'm going to answer this question the way I understand it. When you own a home jointly, and let's say you lived in that home for the past 5 years, you get a exclusion of $500,000, and you can use the proceeds whichever way you want. I'm not aware of any rules that essentially allow you to transfer a certain amount, 250 into the CCRC. So my answer would be negative, at least the way I understand this question.
No, tomorrow. I sent you an email today, but it was too good though, I think.
Please mute your.
Susan, sounds like looks like you're muted yourself.
Sorry. Someone writes, my in-laws outlived their income for many years and were not kicked out of their CCRC. How common is this feature?
Yeah, so
That,
this is oh,
yeah.
yeah. So some of them, they specifically tell you that up front, they have those provisions, and they say that, once you get in, they'll check your financials, by the way. You need to qualify for it.
Yeah.
And they basically say if you run out of money, the way it operates behind the scenes, is essentially to get some money from Medicaid then. So yeah, that's a relatively uncommon situation, by the way, but I probably shouldn't say I'm glad, but it's good to hear that it worked out for your parents this way.
Um, okay, let's see. Thoughts regarding relative risk to buying in for profit versus nonprofit communities.
Uh, okay, so let me
Yeah,
thoughts. Okay, relative mine.
profits.
Yeah. So see, the thing is, not for profits, and I've been involved in some of them. There are more guarantees and there are certain services they provide. The ones that are for profit, they're usually higher tier communities, and they provide different types of services that tend to be more appealing to people. I'll just put it this way. So not for profits are perhaps more secure, depending on how they're structured. Like the example that was made earlier, perhaps that was the case. Um, in terms of the risks, I like to think of it from the perspective of the resident. That's how I would like to look at it. I try to focus mostly on the positive side of things here, but I'll share this with you. We had a number of conversations with our clients. Well, I was the one saying that, look, this particular choice that you're presenting to me is not likely to work for you in the long run. I said it more gently than that, but doing all of this math up front and projections in my mind is what reduces those risks in the long run.
Okay. Uh, Average increases in costs year to year and regional comparison, assuming facilities not in big cities are cheaper.
Well, that's been
Mhm.
my observation. Yeah. So what's the name? We have someone who transitioned again. It's closer to Frederick, I want to say. I don't remember the name of that community. I worked on it several years ago at this point. I remember looking at the documents and like what I shared with you a moment ago, what you see on your screen, it was significantly more affordable. So again, I didn't touch on that because for many people, you see, when they transition, especially earlier, in life, it's important for them to remain in, approximately in their community. So as an example, if you live in DC, well, there's a good possibility that you would prefer to stay in a CCRC that is close to DC. But at the same time, if you're looking for, let's say, higher quality, more manageable cost in the long run, yeah, going outside of Beltway will at least partially solve your problem. At least that's my experience. In terms of the inflation question or increased costs, so a lot of it has to do with the medical expenses. So you see, like we touched on living expenses, right? Which is again what you see on the slide here. So you're looking at 3 to 4, 4 to 5% a year. That's been my experience. On the medical side, it can be much more than that. Of course, depending on the care, who provides it and the quality of that care. So 6% would not be, unheard of.
Ah, do CCRCs have standard credit ratings like bonds do?
Hmm. So so they're rated. You have auditors reviewing their statements and then they give you their opinion. um, I wouldn't necessarily call it that way. At least the ones I reviewed, they show you how they invest. They show you the coverage ratios. I mean, it's a pretty detailed document. but no, wouldn't call it that.
Okay. Okay. Ah. Do you know anything about the community Corso that's being built on Connecticut Avenue where the 4-H club is?
I'm just gonna give you my short answer is negative. You see, I actually come to different events and I visit them. Most of the information that I shared with you today, it really comes from our clients. So they visit those communities, they gather information, and then we're the ones doing the due diligence. By the way, not to again advertise for anyone, but there are groups out there that help you pick the community. Like I've worked with one of them. They literally, sit down with you. They'll interview you, look at your finances. Let's say we prepared your finances. They'll look at that and they'll make suggestions based on your preferences. They'll go with you to visit, like there's services like that, but that's not what we do.
Is there anything that reliably compares the quality of various places, staff, amenities, etc.?
That was like I don't know, somehow I was anticipating that
Nah.
question, I guess. So yes, there are services out there that would help you compare. You would pay them, right? You would pay them a fee, and in some sense, for a decision like this, in my humble opinion, it's probably totally worth it, because it's an expensive one, and you want to make sure that someone who is independent is advising you on that. Goes without saying, any community you visit, they'll tell you they're, provide the best possible services and they're the best in the world. But again, you need to do your own due diligence. So,
Won't medical expenses be covered by the same types of insurance you have in your own home, i.e. Medicare and a supplemental? I would think yes, right?
well, the answer is yes, but at least the way I read this question, maybe I'm just not reading it correctly. So, there's different types of insurance. Medicare is, for doctor visits, right? In terms of long-term care, it's a very different type of policy, right? So long-term
Yeah,
care insurance pays,
yeah.
like I said, when you're no longer able to perform any 2 out of 6 activities of daily living. It's very different from Medicare.
Okay. Um,
Baywood's question.
Someone asked, what's the name of the coming community on Connecticut Avenue? I think that's Curso, isn't it? Susan, you know. Susan Hamburger, unmute
Yeah,
yourself.
it's Corso Chevy Chase.
Corso.
It's scheduled to open in the end of 2028, and it's going to be a rental.
And how is that spelled? Corso or
Corso.
Oh, okay.
And they have a website that's corsochevychase.com.
Yeah. One of the questions I literally got from one of the clients yesterday, before yesterday, she was asking, does it make sense to like look at the communities now? She's thinking like 10 years in the future. And like even this comment, there's so many of them, over the past number of years that, committing to anything like this, if you have a 10-year timeline, just not sure about that. And there was also a question, I guess we skipped, but I read it pretty quickly. Again, there are a lot of communities that are being built. There was a question about like some kind of glut. So, yeah.
There were some questions about Bay Woods, which I looked up and it looks like that's in Annapolis.
It's in Annapolis, correct.
And someone asked, which type of community is it?
So, okay, this one, I don't think I went in that level of detail. So you actually become, it's a co-op. So you become a shareholder essentially. So it's different, from what I mentioned earlier, in the way that you actually buy it from the resident. So someone vacated the property and you bought their shares. So yeah, that's another kind of wrinkle in this story.
Yeah, someone writes, if you have long-term care, it covers in-home care if you selected and paid for that. I think long-term care policies vary a lot depending on what company you get it from. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. You have to be very careful with them, what they cover, what they don't cover, what the waiting periods are, what type of policy. The vast majority, by the way, are reimbursement policies. So you have to pay for it yourself,
Uh-huh.
then you get reimbursed. Yeah, there's a lot of things to look at. In terms of the in-home care, usually it's partial. So if you transition, then they provide, their full nominal benefit. For in-home, if I'm not mistaken, there's usually like a 75% a limit. Not in all policies, but at least that's what I remember.
Is the refund percent for buy-in based on the length of time of your residence there?
That is correct. So I'll go to one of the earlier slides here. So the 50-month decline in entrance fee. I don't know if I'm going to do this math correctly, but let's say the buy-in. Okay, let's make it $500,000 just to keep the math simple. If you stay there for 25 months and you vacate the property, well, your estate is going to receive, half of the refund, so 250,000 in my case, in my example. If you stay there for 51 months, your estate will not receive any refund, but at the same time, you'll continue to receive their services for a lower monthly fee.
Okay.
I don't
So I
think
think
that's
we've
the
come to,
question you asked, Susan. He didn't answer your exact question. Your question was about the buy-in.
Yeah, so that is my answer. So that's the buy-in fee. So like we're gonna go back. So let's say the buy-in is $500,000. Just I'm gonna keep it simple, just to use rounded numbers. If you move into the property and you vacate it in 25 months, right in the middle of the period, your estate is going to receive 250,000, which is proportionate to how long you stayed there. If you continue to live there, and let's say something happens and once you're there for 51 months, your estate will no longer receive anything. So that's the idea that
Are they
buy-in
all like
declines.
that?
No, they're not. In fact, you'll have an option. Let me go back to this slide here. So one of them is, again, Ingleside here, where there's that option. So I don't know, perhaps I didn't explain it very well. They'll give you those choices. You will make that choice. That's, again, when you'll do your own analysis and say, for me specifically, for my estate planning purposes, perhaps since I'm going to be spending so much of my money, I want to go with the 90% refundable because for my estate planning goals, I want my family to have some assets left. Just to give you a simple example, for those of our clients who probably shouldn't say don't care, but it's less important for them, perhaps the declining is more palatable, meaning that if they spend a lot of money up front, and I'm trying to jump around here, but like let's say they just die within 3 to 4 months, at least their estate will receive most of the buy-in. So it makes it easier to make that decision. That's usually the context for it.
But that 90% that you want back is not affected by how long you live there. Correct?
If that's the option you selected. So it can be 50%,
Right.
it can be declining. Maybe again, I'm not like it can be just 90% refundable, right? So you pay $1 million for your buy-in, you vacated the property 15 years down the road, your estate receives 900,000. You vacate the property 2 years from now, your estate receives 900,000. And then there's the declining one, which, it's a relatively simple table that shows you how much your estate would receive depending on how long you stay at the community.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. This has been so informative for many, many of us. And thank you all for joining Chevy Chase at Home today for one of our speakers series. I invite everyone to explore other programming listed on our website, which is just chevychaseathome.org. I think that's in the chat, and to consider joining your local village as a member or volunteer, whichever local area you live in. There are many local villages. Chevy Chase at Home is just one of them. So thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks especially to Alex for a wonderful and very informative program.
Well,
Take
thank you
care.
again, Susan, for
Thank
inviting
you.
me, and thank you everyone for joining us today.